Welcome to the Falklands case study. This was a conflict that occurred in the spring of 1982 between the United Kingdom and Argentina. We will be following the Royal Marines of 3 Brigade throughout this case study. The purpose of this lesson is to highlight the importance of having an amphibious force in readiness, which ultimately provides a nation with the flexibility in responding to crises around the globe at a moment's notice. Please click the next button at the bottom right hand of your screen. Today we're going to be going over the task organization and command relationships in higher, adjacent, and supporting units, planning challenges prior to and during the operation, the overall concept of operation, commander's intent and mission, as well as additional capabilities the naval carrier, surface, and subsurface forces provided to an amphibious task force and landing force once established ashore, as well as littoral operations in a contested environment, also known as low-key, requires close coordination with the Navy to achieve all domain dominance to a landing ashore, as well as how did the conflict align with maneuver warfare philosophy, as well as utility of having an expeditionary force in readiness. The terrain on the Falklands is unforgiving with mountains, peat bogs, open terrain, and it is lined by coastal cliffs. These are the Falkland Islands, which will be the setting of our conflict. The Falklands are broken up into 2 main islands. There's East Falkland and West Falkland. East Falkland includes an area to the south called Lafonia, which is connected by a narrow land bridge. Most major transit is done by boat or aircraft, and the vast majority of the population lives on the water. There is a road system, but paved roads are limited, and the majority of the roads are trails that require off-road vehicles to travel. In the spring of 1982, there are 1,800 inhabitants in the Falklands, with the majority of the population living in the capital, Stanley. Stanley lies on East Falkland, where you see the red circle. The remainder of the population is sparsely populated across the islands. The Falklands are located here on the map, where you see the red circle. The Falklands have long been contested by Argentina and Britain dating back to the 1800s. The islands officially belong to the United Kingdom. However, in the 1960s and 70s, the UK was looking to potentially hand over control of the islands to Argentina, who was in aggressive pursuit of reclaiming the islands. The few inhabitants of the Falklands, known as the Kelpers, identify with the Crown and consider themselves British subjects, and they absolutely desire to remain so. The UK, of course, is a long, long ways away. The Falklands are nearly 7,900 miles away from the UK. The citizens are British, but Argentina lays claim to the island as well. In order to paint a better picture of the situation, we must first understand what is going on in British Parliament during the 1980s. Much like the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps have historically faced budget cuts, the Royal Navy and Royal Marines were facing substantial budget, equipment, and personnel cuts in the wake of a comprehensive defense strategy review. Under specific scrutiny was the amphibious capability of the UK. The requirement that the UK Armed Forces maintain a force able to project substantial power abroad by sea was in question, and as a result, the UK had outlined a plan that would see the Royal Navy aircraft carrier fleet and amphibious ships phased out. Additionally, various frigates and destroyers would be dropping from the inventory along with thousands of men, as well as cuts to various naval shore installations. With that orientation to the UK, here is a brief synopsis of the Argentine perspective. In 1976, the Argentine junta took control of the country via a military coup. These actions, though widely supported across the population, ultimately failed. Economically, the country was collapsing, the inflation rate had skyrocketed, the GDP had tanked, and wages are half of what they used to be a year prior in 1975. It is popularly believed that the junta had launched a war against the people, and Leopoldo Galtieri sought to escape this crisis through diverting attention to military action. An operation in the Falklands could distract his citizens from the human rights and economic issues at home by bolstering national pride and giving teeth to the nation's long-held claims on the islands. Such action would also bolster its dwindling legitimacy. And on April 2nd, 1982, Argentina invades the Falkland Islands. When the Argentine invasion was obvious and imminent, these 2 men, the commander of the Royal Marine Detachment in the Falklands, Major Mike Norman, and the governor of the Falkland Islands, Sir Rex Hunt, had a conversation. Major Mike Norman offers that his men could disappear into the hills and live off the land, continually harassing Argentine forces and gathering intelligence on them. Sir Rex Hunt declined the offer and instructed that after putting up an initial fight, the Marines were to surrender, which they did. Argentine special forces land in the capital port of Stanley and these are the photos that begin to circle the globe. These photos enrage the British government, and plans to retaliate are set into motion. The news of the invasion is quickly elevated to the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher. She determined the Argentine junta calculated that with British military cutbacks and their seemingly lackluster care for the islands meant that the British wouldn't fight for the islands. Well, they were wrong. When the Argentines invaded the Falkland Islands, Margaret Thatcher called an emergency meeting with her defense chiefs, asking them how to respond and retake the islands. The service heads of the Army and Royal Air Force basically capitulated, saying it couldn't be done. It was then that the First Sea Lord, Sir Henry Leach, who said recapturing the islands could be done. Prime Minister Thatcher told him to make it so, and British forces are set to depart on Monday, which is in 3 days. We will be following this story through the eyes of 3 Commando Brigade. We are stepping into the shoes of Brigadier Julian Thompson, the commander of 3 Commando Brigade. We are to provide the initial ground fighting power in the Falklands should diplomacy fail. Brigadier Julian Thompson has been serving in the Royal Marines for nearly 30 years at this point, and his staff also has extensive amphibious operations experience. This will prove useful throughout the conflict. The overall strength of 3 Commando Brigade consists of 4,000 men. The force includes the 40th, 42nd, and 45th RM Commandos, 2 and 3 para-battalions, 29 Commando Artillery Regiment, 2 Troops Royal Household Guards and Dragoons, 148 FO Battery, T Air Defense Battery that utilizes the Rapier missile system, Special Air Service, and Special Boat Squadron. This will be our force throughout the conflict. Remember, the UK is completely phasing out its amphibious ships. Parliament couldn't foresee a scenario in which the UK would have to make an opposed landing. The discussion of what if Argentina invades the Falklands and we have no or very limited amphibious capability did happen, and retaking the islands was considered a military impossibility, and there was no contingency plan. Yet, here we are. This is the HMS Invincible, similar to an LPH, one of 2 carriers to head to the Falklands. In fact, it was one of only 2 carriers of any type available in the UK in 1982. The 2 carriers, HMS Invincible and HMS Hermes, are not even part of the Amphibious Task Force, but will support it. They belong to the Carrier Strike Group and are bringing 42 jets that will in part provide air support to the landing force and will also intercept as many Argentine aircraft as possible. The only remaining amphibious ships in the UK are 2 assault ships, the HMS Fearless and her sister ship, the Intrepid. All 4 of these ships are either scheduled to be scrapped or sold, which has been postponed for this conflict. Far from optimal, the amphibious force only has 16 helicopters available for the initial landing, 5 Wessex anti-submarine helicopters and 11 Sea King commandos. Wessex and Sea King platforms are optimized for cargo, anti-submarine warfare, and search and rescue operations, not assault support. However, the Atlantic Conveyor will be bringing a number of Chinooks to assist with the assault support operations on the island, but won't be available until after the amphibious assault. The 2 assault ships, similar to an LPD, have a small flight deck from which 2 support helicopters could operate at any one time. Each also carried small raid boats and 4 landing craft utilities, or LCUs. We, Brigadier Thompson, are serving as the commander of the landing forces known as the Cliff. As we begin to frame the problem and start to think about all the planning necessary to pull off this operation, we determine we need to identify our task, our mission, find out all we can about the enemy, and make an executable plan. Since time is short, the majority of the planning will have to be done in transit to the Falklands during our movement. Embarkation will come first, and it's going to be a scramble to get all of our gear, equipment, ammunition, and personnel aboard with no time to plan the embarkation. We quickly determine there is not enough space on the assault ships to move the force, and the cruise ship, the SS Canberra, is requisitioned and will serve as our ride. The task force heading south will include additional shipping, totaling 62 ships, from the civilian maritime industry that will provide personnel and cargo space for the things that we could not fit on the assault ships. Now, normally we would stow the ships in reverse order of the things needed first, but we can't load until we have a plan, and we can't have a plan until we know something about the enemy. Of course, we know nothing of the enemy at the moment, and we have frantically loaded our war stuff throughout our ships, and we don't exactly have good manifest. This is shaping out to be a pretty sporty operation. And on April 7, 1982, we leave for the Falklands with a naval and maritime task force of 127 ships. We are part of Task Force 317. Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse, the commander of the amphibious force, will exercise overall C2 of Operation Corporate to retake the Falkland Islands and will remain in England. We, Brigadier Thompson, are the commander of the landing force, and Commodore Clapp is the commander of the amphibious task group, or what we would call the commander of the amphibious task force. We have a good working relationship with Commodore Clapp and a joint mindset which will come in handy in speaking towards the distribution of assets. Additionally, we have connected rooms aboard the SS Canberra, which will enable us to easily maintain an open line of communication throughout operations. On 17 April 1982, we find ourselves on Ascension Island, 6,000 kilometers from the Falklands. This is the midway point that becomes our last stop before making movement to the Falklands. For a few weeks, it becomes the busiest airport in the world as supplies and personnel are flown in and ships are restowed. One of the problems identified is the artillery and rapiers are loaded in such a way that makes it difficult to get to and are on a vessel that doesn't support night operations. Those items will need to be offloaded by helicopter during the day. Additionally, we can only support operations for about 6 weeks. While on Ascension Island, our orders come down and task number 4 is the only one applicable to us. Plan to land with a view to repossess the Falkland Islands. The Falklands are in the southern hemisphere, which means winter is coming. These swells will make a landing difficult for our amphibious assault ships, so we need to start developing a plan. Still on Ascension Island, Navy analysts have determined 5 locations that are tenable for an amphibious assault. There is Stevely Bay on West Falkland, and on East Falkland, there is Carlos Water, Teal Inlet, Low Bay, and Stanley. There is currently no satellite imagery, no spies, no photos, nothing that depicts the Argentine defense posture. Your analysts pore through open source intelligence and conclude that Argentina has a largely conscripted military with infantry and artillery capabilities that you'd expect from a modern military, and they have a relatively small, well-trained air force. There are only 3 airfields on the Falklands and only 1 paved runway is in Stanley. The Argentine Air Force has roughly 122 serviceable planes that are capable of harassing your forces from 5 bases located on the Argentine mainland. There are 2 aircraft of particular concern, the Pucara, which is a close air support platform that flies low and slow underneath radar and can land on short airfields across the island. The Superintendar can carry the anti-ship Exocet missile capable of sinking any of the ships within the task force. We will not be going into this fight with air superiority. We leave Ascension Island and head south to the Falklands. On 1 May, British shaping operations begin with offensive airstrikes on the paved runway at Stanley, rendering it inoperable. On the 2nd of May, Argentina is clearly aware that we're coming. What they are not aware of is that Britain already has a nuclear sub in the Falklands that is tailing the Exocet-armed Argentine cruiser, the General Belgrano. As the Argentine fleet moves to threaten the task force, the sub fires 3 torpedoes and scores 2 hits, killing 368 sailors. The attack becomes very strategic, and it ultimately causes the entire fleet to withdraw back to the port for the remainder of the war. 2 days after the sinking of the Argentine cruiser, the British lost the destroyer, the HMS Sheffield, after an Exocet missile strike, killing 20 sailors. As we come within range of the islands, recon teams and aircraft are launched to gather intelligence. Argentine forces know the recon teams are there and ceaselessly search for them. The intelligence gathering is a long and painstaking process. On 12 May, this is what we receive: a 6-phase attack plan for the Falkland campaign. Again, this is verbatim. Go ahead and take a moment to read through it. You may have noticed, but if not, there is now a role for 5 Brigade. This is the first we are even hearing 5 Brigade has been assigned to the operation. And for that matter, what does land operations consist of? Brigadier Thompson had the same questions. The tasking that came down was very piecemeal, and we have some RFIs for Admiral Fieldhouse back in the UK. Keep those limits in mind. Are we going to have air superiority? No. After discussing it with Commodore Clapp and the sinking of the HMS Sheffield, the Exocet missile is too serious a threat to get our carriers in close to the island. This means the landing will have to be conducted at night, and later that day, we receive answers to our RFIs with more specific tasking. Later that day, we receive clarification from Admiral Fieldhouse. Take a moment to read through the task. This clarifies that the UK is mobilizing an additional infantry brigade, 5 infantry brigade. They are also being transported on a requisition cruise ship, the Queen Elizabeth II. They will increase our combat power in the Falklands after the initial landing. We are now landing in East Falklands to avoid the need to make 2 amphibious assaults and to hasten the operation. As of May 13th, SBS and SAS teams have managed to gather intelligence on these locations. This is what they found. They estimate 11,000 Argentine troops on island. That's twice the number of our entire force, and they appear to be massed at 3 main locations. In Stanley, there are 5 infantry regiments dug in, roughly 30 airliftable 105mm artillery pieces, an unknown number of armored vehicles, an air defense radar capable of early detection and fire control, and a helo lift capability of about 200 men per wave. At Goose Green and Darwin, there are estimates of nearly 500 men with artillery as well as Pucara and T-34 aircraft operating out of the airfield. And at Fitzroy, there is a suspected air mobile reserve that includes an infantry regiment, artillery, and a commando company. When we brief our plan, we have concerns about the airfields and the air threats. The airfield at Stanley was already destroyed. An SAS raid is to be executed on the 14th at the airfield on Pebble Island, and this raid will become one of the classic examples on how to conduct an amphibious raid. As for the rest of the plan, the landing will take place at Carlos Water silently at night, which should be unopposed. The main and consistent threat will come from the air. The first priority will be to get the Rapiers up and established to protect against airstrikes that will come at first light. With the beachhead secured, the landing forces will hit the final airfield at Goose Green. With enemy forces out of Goose Green, our forces will break out of Carlos Water and begin movement to Teal Inlet and Fitzroy. The bulk of 5 Brigade will land at Teal Inlet, adding an additional 5,000 troops to our force for the final push into Stanley. The plan is almost killed before even launching the LCUs. D-Day comes May 21st. Night is falling and the attack will launch in a few hours. Recon assets report that a previously unknown company-strength enemy force is overlooking the entrance to Carlos Waters from Fanning Head, the cliffs to the north of Carlos Water. They are equipped with 105mm anti-tank recoilless rifles. This is of concern to Commodore Clapp, who remarks that they could easily sink the landing craft, of which we only have 8. Fanning Head is surrounded by steep cliffs and the unit is well concealed. Additionally, there are reports of an enemy strategic reserve moving to the north of Darwin, size unknown. If the attack is delayed, we could face an opposed landing. We decide to insert a section of SBS to engage the company on Fanning Head during the attack. With the company effectively suppressed, or at least occupied, the landing could be conducted. The SBS inserts 20 troops that scale the cliffs below Fanning Head. They're outfitted with 12 medium machine guns. The idea is to attack and create chaos in the company at Fanning Head. The overwhelming firepower coming from the 12 medium machine guns combined with naval gunfire support didn't just keep the company occupied, it almost immediately routed the entire company. The landing more or less goes as planned. The Argentines never mounted a ground assault against the UK beachhead. Why not is still up for debate. They did not employ many of the tactics they could have, which could have made the British position much more difficult. There has been discussion that Argentina never actually expected Britain to attempt to retake the Falklands, and the commander was unprepared for an actual ground war. As soon as dawn broke with limited aerial defenses and no air superiority, British forces immediately were subjected to harassment from Argentine bombers that would continue until the end of the conflict on June 12th. In the first 5 days of fighting, the British would lose 4 ships. On the first day, the HMS Ardent was lost protecting the landing force. Then the HMS Antelope 2 days later. And 2 days after that, the HMS Coventry is hit while diverting attention away from San Carlos and the precious vessel Atlantic Conveyor, which was transporting the troop-carrying helicopters that would have been used to leapfrog across the island. Without this capability, and with the logistics plan scrapped, the British had to walk to Stanley, all 110 kilometers, with all of their gear. In the first week, the commandos took the airfield at Goose Green after some significant fighting broke out, moving to Teal Inlet, where they met up with 5 Infantry Brigade. The RFA Sir Tristram and the RFA Sir Galahad are lost after staying too close to the shore for too long during the buildup. In a total time of just 3 weeks, the commandos fought across the island. They broke the defense surrounding Stanley in a brigade night attack. They reclaimed the island, which is now an overseas territory of Britain. The British ended up with about 255 KIA, 775 wounded, which 3 civilians from British shelling, 35 aircraft, 7 ships, and they captured 11,313 POWs. Now, Argentina lost around 649 men with 1,657 wounded and 100 aircraft. This was the beginning of the end for the Argentine junta, who was replaced with a democratic government the following year. There is no question that the British commando had a distinct advantage in this war. They were better trained, better equipped, and came with more motivation and willingness to fight. However, this conflict stretched the logistical capability of the British Armed Forces to the limit in order to mount an amphibious operation so far from a land base, in mountainous islands with few roads. While commendable, it was also far from ideal. The Royal Marines and Navy embarked prior to planning due to political pressures. Had Argentina been more competent, and had it not been for the creative minds of Commodore Clapp and Brigadier Thompson, this operation would likely have failed and cost many more lives. The campaign in the Falklands was closely followed and studied by the United States, which in part shifted our amphibious focus to joint forcible entry technologies and techniques, as well as ideas to facilitate rapid response such as maritime pre-positioning, forward presence, and sea basing. Here is some recommended reading material on the Falklands if you'd like to learn more. Additionally, there are multiple documentaries that you can watch on YouTube or online. We hope you enjoyed this production.